Hello and welcome to the Spencertown Festival of Books. I'm your host today, Gerald Seligman. I'm a board member of Spencertown Academy. And we can be reached at spencertownacademy.org, unsurprisingly. And there you'll see all kinds of activities that we've got planned for these weeks of the book festival. And also we have an online sale of rare books and special books. So all of this you can check out on spencertownacademy.org, and the book sale goes until October 12th. This is the penultimate session we have, and previous ones are streaming on demand, so check the website. Next Tuesday on September 22nd at 7:30 p.m., we are pleased to have Jill Lepore, the New Yorker columnist and contributing editor, whose most recent book she'll be discussing, which is This America, The Case for the Nation. And you may know that she wrote this wonderful, dense, fat book called These Truths, which was her history of the United States. But I'm very pleased today to welcome Ed Ward, who has written a 2-volume history of rock and roll. And volume 1 is from 1920 to 1963. 1920 is a year we should talk about because most people would assume later, and from 64 to 77. And Ed is a name and certainly a voice that you may well recall, given his past. Well, let's talk a little bit. Welcome, Ed.
Oh, thank you.
And so, Ed, you're from Port Chester, New York, originally.
Well, no, that's where I was born, just down the street from the Lifesaver factory.
Ah, very important landmark. And your writing career began quite some time ago. What, about 1965, 64?
Yeah, 65, I started writing for Broadside, which was a left-wing folk song magazine. And I did a few pieces for them.
Yeah. And then, of course, early on, you were one of the earliest writers for Crawdaddy and then Rolling Stone.
Right.
With whom you've had an affiliation at various times in your career.
Yeah.
You started with them, what, in 1970?
Yeah, I was hired in 1970. I guess I was writing a year or two before that. But Greil Marcus was the record review editor, and he quit to go back to school, and they chose me to replace him.
Mm. And after that, you were with Cream Magazine, Musician, Gig, Mother Jones, quite a few others. You returned, in a sense, to Rolling Stone to co-author, co-edit their history of rock and roll, Rock of Ages. And the reason I said your voice might be familiar, why don't you reveal why that would be?
Oh, because for almost 30 years, I was doing rock history nuggets for Fresh Air with Terry Gross. And I finally figured, okay, I'll redo Rock of Ages as a history book. And this time I'll get stuff I got wrong right, which I mostly did.
Okay, let's begin with a really basic question. American popular music has, before rock and roll, so many distinctive styles, and leading up to it, you know, rhythm and blues and jazz and jive and popular music and torch songs and Tin Pan Alley and all the rest. And then came rock and roll. What is it that made rock and roll distinct? In a sense, I'm asking, what is rock and roll?
Well, that is an impossible question to answer. I mean, what made it distinct was various formal, you know, structures that were taken from blues and from, well, I guess you were calling jive and I would be calling jump blues. You know, big band vocalist, but blues structured instrumental tracks. And there was also a thing which happened when Little Richard had his first recording session, which was that Earl Palmer more or less invented the rock and roll beat which was not syncopated, not at all. The drumming was not syncopated. A lot of the other stuff was, but the regularity, the metronomic quality of the beat, and also I guess the speed of it was what got teenagers excited initially.
Mm. When you listen to somebody like Louis Jordan and the wonderful music he was doing, which had a sensibility that we might recognize in rock and roll.
Right. Well, Chuck Berry is famous for saying that all he wanted to do was to be Louis Jordan.
Yeah, yeah. Would you consider somebody like Louis Jordan an early rock artist or a precursor, or?
Yeah, a progenitor, a guy who he helped set the stage for the acceptance of the attitude, because his stuff was silly, and you don't get any great social statements out of Louis Jordan directly.
Yeah.
You have to kind of go around the edges to look for them. They're there.
Is you is or is you ain't my baby. Fantastic work with the English language.
Yeah, yeah. He's a forgotten master.
Yeah. Now, what are the ingredients for you that went into the creation of rock and roll that made it something unique?
Well, there's the blues aspect. There is the Earl Palmer drum.
Kind of 4/4, heavy on the.
Oh yeah, 4/4, non-syncopated. That's in there. The adaptation of those innovations by the Starlighters, which was the name of the band that was backing up Elvis before they just became his backup band, and the acceptance by both teenagers and the record industry. The record industry saw this as something they could sell, which is very important. Mm-hmm. And teenagers saw it as something they could buy.
Some others?
Well, there was always a tributary of country music. I mean, this is one of my big mistakes. I was teaching a course in rock and roll history, knowing nothing about it when I was in college in 1968, I think. And I said that Elvis was the first white man to fuse rhythm and blues and country music. And one of my students shot up his hand and said, "What about Bob Wills?" And that's true. There was a jazz-oriented stream of country music, and it emphasized hot solos. Well, you couldn't actually be a member of the Texas Playboys unless you were capable of playing hot.
Now, we live in an interesting time because the whole notion of albums has weakened, and people don't really very often listen to albums. They listen on shuffle, and in a certain way, all time periods are one. So in a shuffle playlist that you might put into one of the commercial streaming services, they'll come up with things from any period, any time, any age.
Yeah.
And therefore, I'm wondering if people have a false impression of the history of rock and roll. Many people will think, okay, it started with, as you mentioned, Elvis,
right.
or Rock Around the Clock, Bill Haley. People who are thinking that, what are they missing?
Well, they're missing context, and they're missing the idea that starting with Mamie Smith, it was a progression, and that as the vocabulary of jazz sneaked into both black and white music, what appealed to dancers and nightclub goers got hotter and less sedate. World War II made it impossible for big bands like Count Basie and Duke Ellington to take to the road. And a lot of them stripped down into small 6, 7, 8-piece bands. Certainly the bands that backed up the blues shouters like Wynonie Harris and Roy Brown and, people like that. They were very small bands.
Yeah. So it was partly an economic push.
Yeah, but also club goers were used to not seeing 15, 20 people set up on the bandstand. That would be a smaller band, and they accepted that. Of course, the rise of amplification had something to do with that. Amplified guitars were very big in the country market because they enabled you to play over the noise of a honky tonk. So when Ernest Tubbs' band plugged in, that was a major innovation.
Yeah. So you've come back again to the notion of country music as an important element, and you mentioned blues and jazz, obviously. R&B is what, a little later, isn't it?
Well, rhythm and blues is, I don't really know what that means. I refer to these blues shouters as rhythm and blues.
Yeah.
Because it really wasn't mainstream. It was a new way of playing old music.
Yeah.
So having a guy in front of a band with horns and a hot piano player and a good drummer, that quickly appealed to once again, teenagers.
Yeah.
They bought a lot of that stuff, although they couldn't go out to the nightclubs where these people performed.
Now, we've mentioned Elvis as a major figure, and I want to talk more about him. But between Mamie Smith and Elvis, what are some of the other bigger stepping stones, the important artists on the way to Elvis and really the explosion of the youth culture at that moment?
There were bands that were not taken seriously by jazz lovers, but were very popular in the nightclubs. Lucky Millinder was one band. I've heard some of the records that are just Lucky Millinder records. They're not very interesting, but he did have a way of hiring really good vocalists. So we get Wynonie Harris out of the Lucky Millinder band.
Mm-hmm.
Who Threw the Whiskey in the Well was a Lucky Millinder record with a vocal by Wynonie Harris. After that, things got a whole lot better, especially after Harris was able to get rid of Millinder and Apollo Records and move on to King, where he had a guy working to find him great material and writing it if he had to.
Mm.
So
it seems like so often in music history, in popular music history that we have on recordings, it got most interesting when the developments were happening so quickly that the record labels in the industry didn't have time to figure it out to make carbon copies.
Right.
It kind of exceeded their grasp. And
well, they did make carbon copies in that if this record is a hit, we'll make one that's almost identical to it because they'll buy it. And sometimes they did, but mostly they didn't. Yeah. They wanted to hear something new. And the pressure of innovation was so big that it meant that things that might have not been acceptable if it was just somebody walked into the record company, they started looking for things that were very unusual.
So what do you think is the first, I wouldn't say moment, but the first songs, first experiences, first events where the thing we recognize most clearly as rock and roll was born?
Well, that's almost impossible to say. Some of it is Elvis on Sun Records. Some of it is Little Richard on Specialty. A lot of really great music came out on Specialty out of Los Angeles, and then later out of New Orleans when they hired a guy named Sonny Bono to be a talent scout down there.
Yeah.
He found a lot of great music in New Orleans. Little Richard, for one. Well, that was Bumps Blackwell, his predecessor, was responsible for that. But you know, there was a lot of stuff. A lot of this stuff was coming up in the clubs, and so if you were in Sonny Bono's job, probably what you'd want to do would be to monitor what was going on in places like the Dewdrop Inn, you know, which was a fairly wild and woolly bar where they had drag shows and people like Guitar Slim and his 30-foot electric guitar cord, where he would walk through the audience and then out onto the street.
Yeah.
Then the people in the street would follow him in and pay admission to hear some more of him, you know, because that was what he did.
You know, when Little Richard passed away very recently, there were a lot of articles kind of reiterating his sense that he never got the credit he deserved for being one of the early creators of rock and roll and most important figures. How do you feel about his role?
Well, he was important, but he was also erratic. I mean, the idea of being scared of Sputnik and throwing your jewelry into Melbourne Harbor and then joining the ministry, that's not a good career move. It really isn't. Even though some of his gospel records were quite wonderful, his rock and roll records were better. And if he had had the courage, like Sam Cooke, to stick to that, then he might have become even bigger. So he was, I think, in a way, self-destructive. Also, I don't think he was quite aware of what a radical figure he was, you know? I mean, gay and flamboyant and with that weird Alex Bradford woo that he does with his voice, you know, that he didn't realize. Well, he called his band the Upsetters, but he didn't realize that he was the upsetter. He was the one who was really, you know,
a wonderfully outrageous figure.
Yeah.
And New Orleans, Dave Bartholomew, people like that are very important. New Orleans itself is certainly very important in the formation of rock and roll, as it is in so many things, of course, jazz. How would you characterize the New Orleans role?
Well, New Orleans had a very strongly established nightclub scene. And you had people like Dave Bartholomew who led a band that was, you know, excellent backup material. So that when Fats Domino needed a band, Bartholomew was there. Yeah. But he also made records on his own. He was a trumpet player, Bartholomew, and that was important. I mean, what the guitar is to later rock and roll, trumpets were to early rock and roll, you know, and having Dave Bartholomew as your band leader was an attraction.
Yeah. And speaking of New Orleans, Fats Domino, of course, is a really important early figure. You talk a lot about him in the book.
Yeah, I mean, Fats Domino was important because he was well steeped in blues. He had Bartholomew backing him up, but he was just so safe. He didn't sound that black. I have a CD box of all of his Imperial recordings, and I just can't listen to a 70-minute CD of one Fats Domino hit after another. He's boring. He's so safe, he's boring. You know, there's no outrageous Fats Domino record you can name. There are outrageous Dave Bartholomew records. Who Drank My Beer When I Was in the Rear? The Monkey Speaks His Mind. Those are pretty crazy records, but Fats played it safe.
Now you mentioned safe. Um, are you alluding to the fact that a lot of the early rock and roll was created by African Americans and listened to by young white audiences?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of understood that there wasn't that kind of mixing, except when you were. I mean, the people who did mixed races were people like Elvis, who was a poor white kid near Memphis who liked Black music and found out that Black musicians and audiences tolerated him. He would go by a show, there's a famous photograph of B.B. King and I think Junior Parker and Elvis hanging out outside of a theater somewhere in Memphis. And that was okay. I mean, as long as not too many people did it, it was definitely okay. And it was also one way. It was white kids going to see Black music.
So tell us why Elvis Presley is such an important figure.
Well, he was good. He had a lot of energy. His performances were electrifying. And he just, once he took over, and once those early records started getting on the radio, he was a figure of some importance, and in fact, enough of a figure that he was the subject of a bidding war, and wound up on RCA Victor.
Mm-hmm. There's the famous stories about Sam Phillips, who was the first person to record Elvis, and Johnny Cash, and Carl Perkins.
Parker.
Yeah.
And I can't remember. He didn't. B.B. King wasn't on his label, but may have recorded in his studios.
But there's that famous story, and maybe apocryphal, where supposedly Sam Phillips was saying, if I could discover a white singer to play Black music, I'll have a huge success.
If I could find a white man with the black sound, I'll make $1 billion.
Right. And that is a true story?
Yeah.
And in a sense, he found his white man.
No, he said that a number of times to people. He'd find some country guy and record him, and he'd find some blues guy and record him. And then he'd say, man, if I could just find a white boy, because he knew that a white face was a key towards even larger things, better bookings, television. I mean,
yeah.
Thinking of television back then was absurd. But, because rhythm and blues artists did not appear on television. Black people didn't appear on television.
So after Elvis, let's work our way up a bit more. And you mentioned 1955 as a key year, and you've even got a chapter title something to the effect of the birth of rock and roll 1955, or is it?
Yeah, I mean,
why the question?
Well, who knows? I mean, there were enough important records in 1955 that market dominance of this new teenage rhythm and blues inflected music was a fact.
Yeah.
And also, the major labels began to think, we're missing out on something to all these fly-by-night tiny labels. People like Decca and RCA thought, oh, maybe we can do this. And of course, Columbia under Mitch
Miller,
yeah. They thought, no, we can't do this. So they didn't. And they missed out on a lot.
Yeah.
They put out some pretty hot country records after a while, but that wasn't Miller's division. That was the Nashville division.
So let's go to the 1960s. there's a temptation to ask the biggest question, which is what happened? Because suddenly there, everything took off and everything transformed and developed in so many directions simultaneously.
Well, one important juncture of all of that was the development of the electric guitar. That you could now make an electric guitar play loud. The guy who invented this, Dick Dale, who was he was an owner of a music store. His hobby was surfing, and he had a band that played all instrumental music. And so he got his father to invest in Deltone Records and started putting out instrumental records, which were huge with teenagers all over the place. Teenagers found out that they could buy these electric guitars fairly cheap because many of them weren't very good at that point.
Yeah.
And they could do this too. Also, Dick Dale was in contact with Leo Fender, not so much for building his guitars, but for building his amplifiers. And that's, reverb, all that stuff. Dick Dale was the man who did that. And nearby to where he was doing his thing was the Wilson family, which was a frustrated musician and his sons. And the sons decided, well, actually, two of them were off surfing one day, and one of them asked the other, there's all this so-called surf music, but nobody's singing songs about surfing. It would seem to me it's something that people should sing about. And so they went back home and they wrote a song called Surfin'.
And their name was?
I think one of them was Mike Love, and the other one was Dennis Wilson.
Yeah, the Beach Boys. Yeah.
Yeah, they became they recorded it as the Beach Boys because their brother Brian Wilson was very much into vocal arrangements.
Yeah.
And Carl Wilson already had something of a doo-wop thing going with Brian. So they call themselves the Beach Boys. Their father had some friends who had a recording studio in the neighborhood, and they went in and they recorded Surfin'. And it just took off locally to the point where Capitol Records, which was a country music powerhouse that had a lot of pop success, they were pestered by Murray Wilson to sign his boys. And somehow the Beach Boys just took off.
The tandem development suddenly was American music, the Beach Boys, and this whole wave you're talking about. And somewhat unexpectedly, the UK. More like, why did rock and roll itself and blues-based rock and roll take off the way it did in the UK?
That was London, America, a record label that London Records formed to make independent deals with American record companies and release some of this music that was popular in America. Now, London was a big, big record label. They had a giant classical division, and they had Mantovani. They made bucket loads of money off of Mantovani. And so London, America, this silver and blue label became known to teenagers as a place where you could find weird, noisy music. I mean, they made a deal with Specialty early on and released Little Richard records.
And of course, it was London who started signing their own British talent, like the Rolling Stones.
Well, later, yeah, they began to realize that once the skiffle generation had progressed to trying to copy the originators of skiffle, and Alexis Corner, who was a strange man who played guitar with a big band in Britain. He he had a thing called Blues Incorporated. I mean, Brian Jones was such a fan that he used to sleep over at the Corner's house. And I remember Alexis's wife Bobby telling me that the reason that that the Rolling Stones formed was it was a way to get Brian out from underneath the breakfast table.
And it was Brian's group initially. He formed the
Yes,
Rolling Stones.
and he was the chief fanatic. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
we play rhythm and blues. We play authentic music. He was calling himself Elmo Jones.
Yeah.
But he put these ads in the British Music Press, which was something else that we never had here. I mean, Musical Express started in the jazz era and became New Musical Express, and then there were Sounds and Melody Maker, and you know there were all these weekly papers that were the sources of information about all this stuff.
Mm.
Alexis Corner went and managed to get Muddy Waters over to play London. I mean, he just called Chess Records, and there he was. He subsidized the plane ticket. That was a huge success.
Yeah.
And they started bringing over more and more of these black guys whose stars had completely faded in the United States. You know, black music audiences were onto something else entirely by that point. You know, here's Muddy not only getting a chance to work, but a chance to work in London. Hell yes, I'll take that plane.
Right. Right, especially because in a certain sense, the UK, a lot of the artists were holding up a mirror to the US, saying,
Right.
look what you have that you don't recognize.
Right.
This amazing tradition. And like the jazz musicians in the 40s, 50s, you know, making a career in France and Paris and elsewhere, the blues musicians suddenly had a lot more opportunities in the UK than they did in the US.
The UK and Germany, there was the American Folk Blues Tour,
Yeah.
which a promoter put together in Germany, and some enterprising filmmaker made a film out of. And it was weird because a lot of it emphasized the poverty of the performers, where they were all at a train station and stuff like this. But there are clips of this which are available on YouTube to watch of American folk blues.
Like Rosetta Tharpe at the train station, it's so strange.
Yeah, well, but not only her.
She's on one side of the tracks and the audience is on the other. It's a very bizarre setup.
Yeah, I don't know what well, you know, these people, they didn't have any idea. They had no clue what it was that they were filming.
Yeah.
They
So
just
tell me
knew-
about the Beatles and Stones and the whole English wave.
That's kind of a broad question.
The broader, the better. Then I can sit back, take
Well,
a
the Beatles evolved out of a skiffle band, and the Stones evolved out of Alexis Corner and Blues Incorporated. That's basically, well, it's basically what you need to know right there, in that one band was a pop band and the other was under the control of a rhythm and blues fanatic.
Mm.
And for a while, that's exactly the way it was.
Well, the Beatles were also very much into rock and roll. When that
Well,
early
they
wailing
were-
voice of Paul McCartney comes directly from Little Richard.
Yeah, and before that from Alex Bradford.
Yeah.
But the Beatles were more interested in the pop end of the rock and roll experience, i.e., they covered Motown. Motown was not intended to be a blues or a rhythm and blues or a soul experience. It was intended to be a pop factory.
Yeah.
And so you get the Beatles doing, you know, Wait a Minute, Mr. Postman. You get them doing Boys by the Shirelles. You know, these are, well, that's not Motown, but these are very definitely pop black records that they're imitating or performing.
Now you highlight 1965 as an important year in the history.
Yeah.
And wonder if you'd read something from edited from the book about that year.
Yeah, sure. I was particularly happy about this because I knew a lot of the people who were involved. And my first visit to San Francisco, I stayed with the people involved and got to see a lot of stuff as it was just happening. Anyway, yeah, this is kind of an edited version of the first half of maybe of chapter 2 of volume 2, and it's about the real summer of love,
which for you is 65 and not 68.
Yep.
Or 69.
8. Oh no.
9.
A great number of things happened in June 1965, enough to make me wonder if it would be prudent to consult an astrologer for an explanation. Some of them were decades in the making, some mere years, and others spur of the moment. But in retrospect, there's little doubt that this was an earth-shaking month. One of the events had its genesis one night when 3 friends were in a small cabin nestled in a played-out silver mine in Silver City, Nevada, just south of Reno, that its owner, Don Works, dubbed the Zen Mine. That was a pun on D.T. Suzuki's popular book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Works had moved there several years earlier to be near the Paiute and Washoe practitioners of his adopted religion, the Native American Church, which included peyote sessions. Mylan Melvin, a man who wore many hats in this era, remembers the 1963 peyote session at Works' place in which Native Americans and young white people, including Chandler Laughlin, a wandering entrepreneur of folk-friendly coffee houses, participated as an event that bound together a nascent community. But this evening in early 1965, nothing so spiritual was going on at the Zen Mine. It was just Works, Laughlin, and a rich kid named Mark Yanofsky gathered at a table playing the board game Risk and smoking pot to the point where they didn't notice they were socked in by a blizzard. Yanofsky had a problem, or rather his father had a problem. His son had left Memphis for San Francisco to play the folk clubs and had fallen in with a questionable crowd. It was high time the young man learned how to stand on his own, so his father told him he was cutting off his allowance, but would spot him up to $5,000 to help get a business going. Works noted that there was a big building 4 miles up the road in the ghost town of Virginia City, another casualty of the Comstock lode. It had been a real Wild West joint, a hotel with a capacious bar on the ground floor, which also featured a stage. Only a 4-hour drive from San Francisco, it was an ideal weekend destination and a fine place for a vacation. And Works thought it could be had for almost nothing. Both Laughlin and Yanofsky suddenly had a vision of a great place for touring folkies, not to mention the San Francisco crowd they both ran with. Yanofsky bought it, hired carpenters and plumbers, painted it red, and christened it the Red Dog Saloon. He hired Jenna Worden, a French-trained chef, to prepare meals, and sent Laughlin to San Francisco to buy furnishings. Fortunately for him, a Lux movie palace, the Fox Theater, had just gone out of business, and its velvet curtains and other fixtures were going for almost nothing. And while he was in town visiting with some friends of his on Pine Street, he met a young guy with very long blonde hair, wearing Edwardian clothing from one of the many thrift shops in the quiet neighborhood in which he lived, down at the tail end of Haight Street, where it ended up at Golden Gate Park. The young man, George Hunter, said he had a band, but not a folk band. It was a rock and roll band called the Charlatans. The band's piano player, Michael Ferguson, had recently run a store called Magic Theater for Madmen Only, selling antique clothes, odd objects with some age on them, and possibly other things. What Hunter neglected to tell Laughlin was that they'd never played, never even rehearsed, in fact. But Laughlin was already entranced by how cozily they fit into the look that was a building at the Red Dog. He asked them what they were planning to do for the summer. And when they said they had no plans, hired them unheard as the house band. Meanwhile, in Virginia City, things were moving quickly. Ellen Harmon, an old friend of Laughlin's, was installed as dishwasher, and her friend Luria Castell, a longtime political activist who had once gone to Cuba for the sugar harvest, handled the books. Alton Kelly, an artist, went up to supervise the construction, and an itinerant folk singer from Seattle, Lynn Hughes, dressed up as Miss Kitty and helped out in a number of capacities while Don Works tended the bar. On June 29th, the doors were thrown open to the public, such as it was, and on the way, they passed Washoe Joe, 385 pounds of Indian, wearing a top hat and a velvet sash that announced that it had belonged to the Rainbow Girls, whoever they were. Joe was the bouncer. He was rarely called upon to bounce. On opening night, the sheriff paid a visit and, in the custom of the land, walked up to the bar and told Works he'd like to check his pistols. Works picked it up, pointed it to the ceiling, squeezed the trigger, and the gun went off. Seems to work, he told the nonplussed lawman. A lot of legend has grown up over the ensuing months, but among the undeniable things that happened was that the Charlatans became an actual rock and roll band, and a lot of people formed bonds that would prove to be lifelong. And in late September, as the winds that would bring the blizzards started, Alton Kelly, Luria Castell, Ellen Harmon, and Lynn Hughes drove back to San Francisco, wishing they could keep the spirit of summer they just lived through alive. As it happened, the opportunity to do that awaited them. And how? The four veterans of the Red Dog Saloon found a changed pop landscape when they arrived back in San Francisco at the end of September. For one thing, San Francisco seemed to have sprouted a bunch of new bands. On the same block as the Charlatans' house, a crazy bunch from the scene around Stanford University had moved in. They'd evolved out of a bluegrass band that had evolved into a jug band, Mother McCree's Uptown Jug Champions, consisting of banjo guitarist Jerry Garcia, harmonica player Ron Pigpen McKernan, whose father had been an R&B disc jockey, and guitarist Bob Weir, who was taking lessons from Garcia, and Robert Hunter. One day they decided that this wasn't the direction they wanted to go in, so they sidelined Hunter, added drummer Bill Kreutzmann, and plugged in. They called themselves the Warlocks and talked their way into a regular gig at Magoo's Pizza Parlor in downtown Palo Alto, playing 6 nights a week, 5 sets a night, with Chuck Berry numbers, some adapted jug band tunes, and British invasion material. Word got out among the local high school students that there was a cool band at Magoo's, and they began drawing a couple of hundred people each night. On May 1965, an odd college student named Phil Lesh, a couple of years older than the Warlocks, went with some friends to see this phenomenon. And although he'd been writing avant-garde classical music, he heard something in this band that had potential. Talking to Garcia subsequently, he was surprised when Jerry said, "You should play bass with us." Suddenly the Warlocks sounded a great deal better. Finally, the band decided it was time to go for the big time, which in their case meant the big city, San Francisco. And another wooden Victorian house near Haight Street became inhabited by an anarchic crew of young people. They pulled money from their gigs to make a demo tape, but by the time they went into Golden State Studios in early November, they discovered that there was another Warlocks on the East Coast that had a record deal. A new name was imperative. The tape from Golden State was labeled as being by the Emergency Crew, but that was temporary. Shortly thereafter, someone pulled down a hefty Funk and Wagnall's dictionary from a bookshelf and opened it at random. A finger stabbed out and hit a term used in the study of mythology, in which the hero is helped in his quest by the souls of the departed who loved him, the Grateful Dead. It stuck. As Garcia explained later, that name was just repellent enough to filter out curious onlookers. By the middle of October, the four Red Dog folks figured it was time for a show, so they borrowed some money and put down a deposit on Longshoremen's Hall in the North Beach district of San Francisco. Putting up a couple of posters and distributing a lot of handbills, they advertised a tribute to Dr. Strange event. for the evening of October 16th, featuring the Charlatans, the Jefferson Airplane, the Marbles, and the Great Society. The promoters were calling themselves the Family Dog, and they had no idea what would become of this odd event. Alton Kelly was even nervous enough to grab a handful of tickets and stand outside the hall selling them. As it turned out, a couple of hundred people showed up from all over, and it was the Bay Area equivalent of London's Albert Hall poetry reading in June, a "who are all these people" moment of affirmation that there were a lot more odd people out there than anyone had guessed. At the end of the evening, the crowd even picked up after itself before leaving. The next day, Ralph Gleason, jazz columnist of the San Francisco Chronicle, reviewed it in glowing terms. One thing nobody noticed: the event lacked a dance permit and was thus illegal. But it would never happen again, right? Right. There's only one first time for anything. But they did it again the next weekend with a tribute to Sparkle Plenty, featuring the Charlatans again, along with the Love and Spoonful. The Jefferson Airplane attended but didn't perform, and the Grateful Dead's Phil Lesh walked up to Ellen Harmon and told her, "Lady, what this little seance needs is us." So, among the facts in volume 2 of my book is that the San Francisco scene was, in fact, started by women. All those people from Pine Street, which was the place I stayed when I went to San Francisco that first time in 1967, they were the original Family Dog. They eventually sold the name to a guy named Chet Helms, who was one of the crowd of Texans who invaded San Francisco. And I was out there doing a story for an odd magazine called Aspen, the magazine that comes in a box. And I interviewed one of the Cohen brothers who owned a place called the Psychedelic Shop, which sold incessant papers and day-glow posters. And he said, "Whatever you do, use the power of the press wisely. We don't want a lot of people coming out here this summer from all over the country. We just don't want them. And we can't handle them. We don't have the resources."
That didn't work out so well for him, did it?
Not my fault. Nobody ever read Aspen, as far as I know.
It's what a unique scene the San Francisco scene was.
Yeah.
And it brings up once again just how regional American music is.
Well, it was.
Yeah.
It's not anymore, which is one of the sad problems. I mean, you have individual towns where there are local bands, but they're always aiming for national recognition.
Right, right. But how would you characterize the San Francisco scene?
I wouldn't. I mean, a lot of the bands were folkies, people who came out of the San Francisco and Berkeley folk music scene and plugged in. Mm-hmm. And they used that sensibility to emphasize virtuosity and country and blues song forms. So that was, I mean, really, if you sat somebody with no knowledge down and played them a bunch of San Francisco records, Jefferson Airplane, the Quicksilver Messenger Service, the Grateful Dead, Country Joe and the Fish, although they're from Berkeley, there's almost no commonality in that music, you know? So it was just something happening, a bunch of "we can do that" moments.
Yeah, yeah. There's something about inspired amateurs that can lead music to unexpected places that are
well, yeah, exactly. It's the same as with folkies, you know.
Yeah.
You know, You have a guitar, I have a guitar, let's pick.
Let me ask you this. We've gotten to the mid 60s to the later 60s, but there were some parallel developments in soul music and Motown and Stax, and which was earlier, obviously. But how does soul and the like fit into the rock and roll picture from your point of view?
Well, you know, black music had always been a wellspring of inspiration for artists from Elvis on down. So, you know, not so much the Beach Boys, but Elvis definitely, and the Stones and all that. So, soul music was, well, another thing that is really important is top 40 radio wasn't segregated back then.
Yeah.
So you'd be listening, and you know, you'd hear a Beatles track, you know, you'd hear some, you know,
Temptations.
an Andy Williams track,
Yeah.
and then you'd hear a soul track, and it might be the Temptations. It might just as easily have been Sam and Dave, or Booker T and the MGs, which was an instrumental group that was backing up almost everybody on Stax. You'd hear soul music, you'd hear the Toys, you know.
Of course, Booker T and the MGs are backing up Otis Redding in the Monterey Festival film.
Yeah.
What an amazing performance that is.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the love crowd, huh?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting the role that the festivals played in the growth of rock and roll, or maybe the consolidation.
Well, what it was that
Monterey.
you had the template of folk festivals, you know, like the
Like Newport.
Newport Folk Festival, and then there was a Monterey Folk Festival for the Bay Area folk scene. So the idea to put on a rock or the Monterey Pop Festival seemed perfectly natural. And the idea was it was pop, it was the whole spectrum. You know, they invited all these people, many of whom didn't show up. But, you know, the Beach Boys had an invitation, they didn't show up.
That was Janis Joplin's big breakout.
Well, yeah, it was the one where Clive Davis saw her and decided to sign her to Columbia, or as my friend Jim Marshall, the great music photographer, said, "Hey, you know, it's you thought there was a lot of action up on the stage. You should have been in the bar backstage." Record executives signing up everything they could get their hands on. That was the real action.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an extraordinary. It's so fortunate that Pennebaker and company were filming the Monterey Festival, because it captures a dynamic moment, almost unlike any that's been captured on film for rock and soul and all the rest.
It's true, you know. There were
Spectacular.
well, this kind of thing wasn't considered interesting.
Yeah.
To film, you know, a bunch of rock and roll people playing through a bad sound system. Nobody's going to sit through that.
Yeah. The Criterion collection, of course, has that film along with a lot of full performances that didn't make the cut. Like the Otis Redding is about 20
Electric
minutes.
Flag.
Yeah, Electric Flag and Blues Project, was it? Or yes.
Could be, I don't know. I'd have to look.
And then, of course, there's the Woodstock Festival and Isle of Wight and all of that. Bring us up to date. From late 60s, how did rock evolve through the 70s?
Well, it became acceptable to major labels since they had the promotional and distribution capacity. They were able to sell a lot more copies of any given record. The fact is that because of the length of a lot of the performances that people were interested in, they started selling albums. And, you know, a $4.98 album is going to make you a lot more money than a 99-cent single. So record companies eventually decided that this weird music that they didn't really understand was very important because it was a huge profit center for them. So that's what we moved into in the 1970s.
Yeah, yeah.
The album,
And of course, the fertility of invention, so many remarkable groups experimenting in ways that were working as often as not.
right? You know, you give somebody 30 minutes instead of 3 to make a statement, they'll take it.
Yeah.
Or if it's the Grateful Dead, you know, they want 3 hours.
Right. And give them 30 minutes and they'll take 3 hours.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. And interesting what you say about empowerment, because that does seem to summarize a key element in popular culture.
We can do this.
Yeah. And the fact that everybody had guitars and played.
Right. And that goes back even to the 20s and 30s when you had people showing up in Bristol, Tennessee, you know, looking to record mountain music. You know, well, yeah, we've always played on the front porch. Let's see if we can make some money.
Ralph Peer knew where to go.
Well, yeah. And he also knew what to do in recording the Stoneman family in Bristol and making a newspaper story out of it.
Yeah.
Here's this mountain man, Pop Stoneman, and his family, and they really are his family, you know, his wife and his kids.
And those same sessions, of course, recorded the Carter family.
Now,
It's interesting that the recorded music era, and by that I mean the time during which musicians can earn from recorded music. So in that sense, it has ended. It was this bubble of maybe 100 years.
yeah,
And previous to that, of course, musicians could only make a living performing.
right.
And now that's becoming true once again. So it's
Right.
interesting that this age, there was this this window that opened for a short time that is now closed. And I wonder what's going to happen.
Well, the point I was going to make in the third volume is that the guys who cut down the fence at Woodstock won. This idiot.
That's a great analogy.
This idiot idea that music is free. It's mine. It's my culture. Culture has never been free. If nothing else, the people who make it need to eat.
Yeah. Pay rent, send their kids to school.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great analogy or metaphor that they cut down the fence and they won. I mean, it's it means we really, in a lot of ways, don't know what's next, because I think, as somebody who came from the music industry, and there was a 10-year period I worked in the big companies, ran a record label, and I think about, you know, how there were so many independent labels, so many people even within majors who were truly dedicated to the music, and there was a lot of abuse as well.
Yeah.
And when I think of the way the music industry was viewed as these vampires, I think, boy, we were the golden age compared to what the tech companies are doing now.
There's another,
because, you know, the big record companies would pay for the recordings, which had to be recouped. They would give tour support. They would help break artists. Sometimes the independents who bless them, we are so responsible for what happened in music. They would stick with an artist for 2, 3, 4 albums before they broke. And now, of course, we've got the tech 1% sucking up all the money from the creators and giving nothing in return.
well, there's also the unpleasant fact that nobody wants to really talk about, which is that all during the era that we've been discussing, music was the central gathering point of teenage popular culture. That's not true anymore. Music is a tiny piece of gaming, of you know, programming,
social media,
all this stuff is other ways that you can be a teenager and not have to be able to play the guitar.
Right.
So,
Which is a major transformation, isn't it?
yes, it is. And nobody has ever been discussing this.
Yeah. Music was the point around which people created their identities.
Right.
Which, as you say,
right.
so.
Are you a punk rocker? Are you a goth?
Are you a mod or a rocker?
Yeah, right, exactly.
So to wrap up, I'm going to ask you to do something that you're going to be reluctant to do, which is, what are some of the bigger statements about rock and roll? What is it? What's the importance in the culture? How do you, like, looking at the massive creation that started for you? Your book starts in the 20s, but with the explosion in teenage culture and the counterculture and all the rest, and then the commercialization of music. But do you have a bigger picture of rock and roll and what it means and how you view it?
There's a couple of things. One of them is the empowerment of teenagers to a degree never before happening in popular culture in the United States. Popular culture, when I was growing up in the 50s, was largely about Broadway shows, about nightclub entertainers, things that were not of great interest to me as a kid growing up. Or for free, I could turn on the radio and I could hear, the stuff I wanted to hear. Turn that down. Yeah, that's really great. The other thing is that there was and still is a big battle between pop music and rock music. That's essentially, the Rolling Stones versus the Beatles. It's essentially the battle between the folky authenticity people and the Peter, Paul, and Mary fans. And that's still going on.
Yeah. Right. Very interesting. Anything else you want to say?
That I can think of.
All right. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, it's fun.